the Kingsway Podcast.
Welcome.
Glad you are here.
Very glad.
Ryan, this is season 3, episode 2.
Yes.
We were thinking about doing 2 episodes in one podcast, and then this episode got deep.
Yeah. I've fought 2 episodes in one podcast like a zealot. That's a stupid joke. You said that about halfway through, and I was like, yeah, we probably could. And then they got to the whole scene with the sending out 2 by 2, and I was like, nope. Those dreams are crushed. Thanks, Jesus.
Thanks so much for tuning in. If you don't know, we're walking through the chosen episodes, kind of doing a little spoilers, a little talk through. The reason we do this, mainly because we're Bible nerds, and we just invite you into the conversation. Some of you, I know, are watching through. I think the season finale just happened this last week. I think 7 episodes. We're now an episode, like I said, this is 2.
Yes.
Super excited about it. Yeah, so if you're watching, man, I hope you're enjoying this as much as I am. Just the depiction and stuff. I felt like this season has even gotten a little bit more, I would say, kind of like adventurous, and like they're going into, they're kind of taking chances with like the topics and the things that they're discussing, and then obviously some of the things that Jesus is starting to unveil to his followers. It's just really cool stuff. And then the depth of the Roman side of things. And like they're taking some kind of liberties, but also I think fully inside of what they would see as Roman history.
Yeah, I think that they are not just quoting scripture, and we've known that since near the beginning. They're not just quoting the Gospels, but they have enough like scholarly backup that they can make a lot of assumptions. So they're claiming that like Simon the Zealot is going to be chased around by other zealots. And as we know, at least from the show, and maybe if you've ever studied the history of this, zealots are like dagger assassins.
Yeah.
Trying to like disturb the peace that Rome thinks they have. Think guerrilla warfare, Vietnam, like dagger assassins trying to upset the status quo. That's one of Jesus' apostles. We know that the guy's name is Simon the Zealot, so we know he was a dagger assassin. They're taking a chance by saying that, oh, now other zealots who aren't reformed like this guy are coming into town and might be chasing him down and might be trying to disturb the peace because Jesus is here. That's not something we know did happen, but that's something we know could have happened because it was happening in general.
It was happening in general, and it could have happened with him.
And that's a lot of the decisions they're making. Is like, as somebody who's dug into this kind of stuff, I'm like, yeah, that totally could have happened.
Well, and it makes it feel just like we keep saying, like 3D flesh. Like it just gives it depth. And I think what it really does too is it does a good job of kind of helping you understand like what Jesus is doing when he's holding these 12 apostles, these 12 disciples in this like close friendship, and the tensions aren't just with what he's saying, but it's also between each other. And like they each have these like dynamic, friendships / like kind of like awkwardness or like quirkiness or like even a little bit like not really socially accepted, and the thought process behind like just being annoyed sometimes that they're around. It's crazy how this episode does a good job of showing that. Where it's like, Peter comes home to his wife. He wants to be alone. There's too many of his friends around. They won't leave him alone. Yeah. The brothers go home to their parents. They want to see and get this special food that she makes, and it's not quite ready, and they're kind of annoyed. And then other people are kind of showing up and maybe wanting some of the food too. And and then the women are like forced to stay in this like teeny little spot, and you can tell all of them are not used to not having their own privacy and space. That's like the first half of this episode where it's just basically like talking about the logistics of just what it would have been like to be traveling and then coming back with. And even
on the logistic concern, I love that this is right after the Sermon on the Mount. There were a lot of logistic concerns, and that's what led to the feeding of the 5,000 is how are we going to feed all these people who came out to hear you preach? And Jesus is like, don't worry, I know multiplication and does it. I did my times tables in the 2nd grade or whatever.
I know food squared equals 12 baskets left over. Sorry.
Yep, we're bad at math. Bible college. But it's like you watch this logistic thing, and I've heard people talk about the feeding of the 5,000 as like, it was a great miracle. Yeah, it facilitated people sitting there and being treated well while listening to a sermon, not being forgotten. But for the people who thought, okay, Jesus is gearing up this whole time to go kill the Romans, all of them, and defeat them and conquer them and make them our slaves and our captives, whatever.
You talking about this before.
That's a tactical advantage to just produce food out of nowhere.
Take care of your army no matter what.
Yeah.
Yep. Oh, yeah.
I mean, that's why like a lot of ancient armies pillaged and whatever, not just because they're evil, but also because they have no food.
Yep.
They aren't just bringing enough food with them for the whole journey on foot. They got to find their food. They got to pick grain. They got to kill animals. They got to whatever. So if you can just multiply food and it takes no time, no effort, no luck, you can do anything. You're unstoppable.
Well, and it really starts to become kind of like, it almost had like 3 or 4 movements, because what this season is kind of doing is it's kind of branching out. Whereas before, Jesus seemed like the main, this is going to sound bad, but like, Jesus seemed like the main thread that all the other characters were interacting with. This more feels like you're starting to watch the people that have interacted with Jesus now branch off into their own stories.
And he's also finally delegating.
Yeah, well, but I mean, like, Jesus is still at the center of the story, but you're like watching this ex-guard that used to watch over Matthew. What is it? Jairus? No, Gaius, who's like starting, like, I love how you said backslide, and I was like, no, he's front sliding. He's front sliding right into Jesus.
Yeah.
And then you got this like Roman assassin that's like hunting down these zealots, that's like curious and like has watched certain things, and he wants to know what's going on.
But curious like a hungry wolf, not curious like, oh, is Jesus actually somebody who's
trying to decide if he's a threat? Like, so he's trying to decide.
It's tough because maybe his facial expressions show a little like actual consideration, but every word out of his mouth feels either deceptive towards Jesus followers and stuff like that, or conniving and sharp and bloodthirsty to Romans and whatever.
He feels like the guy that just stabbed you in the back if he could get an advantage out of it. And
when he was like, what was in the sermon? And he was like, you should always read right to left, and don't do this with your sheep or something.
About horns.
Some Jewish stuff.
Yeah.
I was like, okay, so he wasn't listening at all, or he's lying.
Yep.
But I bet he just like had preconceived notions about what was going on and just like wasn't paying attention for specifics.
I loved it. I love it so much because it's like Gaius and then him have such the opposite response to that sermon.
Yeah.
It's just a beautiful thing. But let's talk about the 2 things that I think were probably my favorite moments in this episode. Maybe you'll agree, maybe you won't. But the first was the kind of restoration of Matthew and his family.
Yeah, with his family.
That was kind of we kind of got a glimpse of that at the very end of episode 1, kind of like a cliffhanger.
Yeah.
And man, just a brutal way to start the episode where you're watching this broken man in Matthew come home to a parent or a father and a mother that basically said, "You're dead to us."
Disowned him. And what makes it even worse, and maybe you can speak into this more than I can, is that on top of them saying, "I have no son," which metaphorically means we don't want to be associated with you, Matthew in the show is portrayed as having some form of autism or something
it's
where
like Asperger's, autism. It's on the spectrum of something.
Somewhere there where what's specifically going on with him is he's a numbers guy. It's more about like black and white things, and he has a hard time understanding metaphors. So the whole 2 first seasons, he's being taught, whenever he joins Jesus' posse, that's a weird way to say apostles. Whenever he joins Jesus' posse, Jesus teaches in a lot of parables and things like that. And he gives a lot of patience to Matthew and spends a lot of time like working with Matthew on like how to understand metaphors and just like giving him grace and whatever. So probably for him, when his father said, "I have no son," he took that black and white and doesn't totally understand metaphors yet. So it's like, there's a lot more, I don't know how to say this in any other way. This is just what's coming to my mind. There's a lot more black and white. There's a lot of like what infants have with object permanence.
Oh, yeah.
And the real fear that your parent is gone because they're covering up their face. But the real fear that like your parents can't see you anymore or have chosen that you don't exist. Maybe that's metaphorically true, but that's probably deeper because he doesn't understand.
Well, and then the Sermon on the Mount is what finally cracks this thing wide open for Matthew because it's not an analogy anymore. He's like, if you're going to whatever, if you're going to go give a sacrifice at the temple and you have a brother that you've, basically he's like, drop it right there and go. To him, he heard that. exactly
as
how
a
Jesus
command.
meant. He's
now, it's not a metaphor for Matthew in that moment, although the people are metaphorical.
Yep.
So instead of you watch him say like, I know it's supposed to be the priest doing the sacrifice, and you're not my brother, you were my parents, but I think it's still like it's like he's still having to do a little calculus to figure out.
Well, and his dad and mom navigate that conversation so well, and having a son in the same way, I can just see that they're not anxious with him or upset with him. They're trying to help him process and move through the conversation and also make him feel heard and understood, because he feels like he has to over explain himself because he thinks so differently, but they're so comfortable with him. They're like, yeah, we know. We get it, Matthew. It's okay. And he's like, you can see him moving on and moving faster and faster.
Yeah.
And I love that you made me rewind it, but he has this little security cloth.
Yeah,
that he holds on to the whole time.
Every kid who has like a teddy bear that they won't leave anywhere without. But for him, it's this like anxiety tool. Since season one, he's doing all these taxes, and every time he thinks, but like toils thinking, so like anxiety. But it could just be thinking about numbers, calculating. But it's a lot of times like scared, anxious, toiling,
like a finger spinner, like
anything, like any fidget tool. He has this cloth he puts in his closed fist and just like squeezes it,
and he runs it through his hand. He runs it through his hand and he squeezes it again.
Yeah. And you watch him in this anxiety moment. He's been in the anxiety of having kind of abandoned his family and his family disowning him and all this stuff. It's being resolved, and then you watch his mom hug him, and he has this anxiety cloth kind of towel napkin thing in his left hand, and he hugs her with his right, and then but she's hugging him with both hands, and you watch him open his hand and let go of that little handkerchief thing, and then reach around and hug her with the other hand too.
And the dad watches it.
Yeah, it's this moment where he's letting go of the anxiety of the stalemate, the like Cold War between him and his parents, in which he feels like the only loser.
Yep.
And he's like finally letting that go.
And I loved it. And then his explanation too of like why he chose to be a tax collector. He's like, I saw it as like making my life better, but I didn't realize it cost you your jobs and your reputation. And I didn't realize it would cost you your status and all this. And now I see it as I was being selfish.
Yeah.
I thought I was just crunching the numbers, but I see now I was being selfish.
Yeah.
And I need to ask for your forgiveness. And then I love that he's like trying to do the numbers in his head where he's like, oh, I got to make this up to you. And the dad's like, sit down. You're not the only one that has to make penance. And then his dad apologizes to him in the sense of like
everything you did was real, and I still shouldn't have done what I did.
Yep. And it was just such a cool moment where they all hugged, and the mom's just in the middle playing this like loving her son, but trying to understand that this needs to happen for her son to grow, and she's trying to recognize
half participant, half referee.
It was just a beautiful scene, and that set the episode up in such a really cool way, because you're like, gosh. And I literally leaned over you and said, this is what Jesus does. He restores families.
Yeah.
And that's the first thing the Sermon on the Mount did, was restore a family.
Yeah.
And it's such a cool concept. But let's jump to the thing that really, like, the end of this episode.
Mm-hmm.
Jesus calls all the disciples together, and he's basically like, I got a mission for you. It's not quite Noah, but it's 2 by 2.
Yeah.
And y'all are going to go out. And how well done was
that? Was so
scene?
well done. The moment he did that, I looked up like where those passages are in the Gospels. Mm-hmm. It's Matthew 10:1, Luke 6:12-13, and Mark 6:7-13, and then kind of again in 9:10 through 9:1 through something. Anyway, all these passages.
Amazing.
It was such a good scene. You could see the confusion and the scaredness on their faces.
They asked him, like,
the fear.
repeat it? Like, I mean,
repeat this part. And he, like, went back and repeated it word for word, which, like, makes the Bible literalists happy. That sounds like I'm not that. But, like, I just mean, like, it's great. The people who are worried about, like, why aren't you just saying what the Bible says? Like, you just went back and did it again.
Did it again.
But then you watch him pair them up. And I was trying to go back and see, do any of these passages pair the disciples up specifically by name? And I don't think so. Maybe I'm wrong.
I haven't looked that up. I wouldn't know.
I don't think so. But it was cool to watch Jesus, at least in the show, pair up very specific pairs. So like pairing up Simon Peter and Judas, really unique pair.
Yep.
As if you were here at Kingsway, I almost said 20 years ago. I mean, 2 years ago, when we were doing our sermon series on Peter in the Gospels, and then that led into our study of 1 Peter in 2021.
Yes.
We talked about how both Peter and Judas denied Jesus.
Yep.
But Judas, full of despair, resorted to killing himself.
Yeah, gave
after
in
the Jesus
to
event.
the despair and did not seek redemption.
Peter was struck hard with his own grief, but just held out for a few days. And Jesus, maybe it was longer, I don't remember. But then Jesus came back to him on the shore, and they have this whole reunion moment, and that's where the Peter, do you love me? Yes, Lord, I do love you. Then feed my sheep. 3 times back and forth happened. So he paired together the 2 guys who are going to betray him the hardest.
Yep.
Who had very different responses. He paired up Big James and Little James and made a joke about how that'll be really funny and humor disarms people, whatever. I was like, that's great.
Such cool. And that thought of the strongest and the weakest being put together.
Yes, that's the other thing, is that later in the episode, Little James, who has this limp, I don't know if that's scriptural, like if that's, it's not unscriptural, anti-scriptural. It's not like that couldn't have happened.
I believe there's something in some of the Apocrypha, or like some of the other, like there's a mention to it. So like it has some legitimacy, but it may not be biblical legitimacy.
It may not be biblical, literally biblical with the canon of 66 books that we have, people who are not Catholics or Eastern Orthodox, a lot of other Orthodox, whatever. But it totally could have happened. So they pair the strongest, Big James, who's like super strong, big, tall, great, and Little James, who's like a singer with a hurt foot. And
well, and I will say, like, to give pause, like that was the one thing out of this entire episode, and one of the that I struggled to understand exactly why Jesus was doing that. I got it, but I was like, ooh, that is tricky, where it's like, because basically he came and he's like, so I'm going to be able to heal anyone, Little James with a limp, and he's like, why haven't you healed me? And they went into this whole theological discussion on like why, and we can go back to that, but that was like probably the one thing. But him sending the 12 out, I loved how it literally went around, like they asked all the questions, like whereas before I feel like in the seasons before they'd have just been like, okay, and then like on the road as they're leaving, they're like,
what do you think he meant?
Between each other.
Or like, does he really think we're gonna do this or whatever?
And now this time they're like, wait, we won't have that chance because he's not gonna be there. So they're all like, what if we die? And he's like,
that was a cool moment where it was weird because Jesus, it seems like to them, Jesus strung them along. Are we gonna die? And he was like, for minutes, was like, a time is coming where this will be very hard and the persecution will be real. It'll be every day. It'll be whatever, but you'll be fine on this one. And I was like, oh, okay.
Well, and the ending of that was so good. There he's like, persecution, and he's like, but I will never ask you to do anything that I do not do. And you will have to follow in my footsteps, and I will show you what it means to give up your life.
Yeah.
And I remember, and then he's like, but on this trip, you're fine. And
like, it's like, thanks for answering your question. In the most
scary way ever.
Yeah. Morbid way possible.
Oh my gosh.
It was terrifying the way he answered it, but it was cool because it was like all the times that Jesus alluded to his future death. This one was so veiled.
It just
also veiling their own suffering in the future and whatever. But yeah, that part was cool.
It felt like the fourth parallel was broken though, where like
fourth wall.
like the fourth wall, where he's like, will we die? And he just like wants to look over at you and be like,
look over at the camera,
not tonight.
Make the sign of the cross, and then just move on.
Like I was just like, I wanted him to be like, but not today. Like, you know, but like, it was almost that feeling. It was, but then I love at the very end, like you could start to see their confidence growing, and they weren't thinking about the fear as much as they were starting to think. So like, wait, we get to heal and cast out demons.
Yeah.
And then their last thing is like, wait, but we got to preach. What do we say? And they're like, and there was Nathaniel was like, he's like, Judas is like, I've only heard one sermon, and Nathaniel's like, it was the best one.
And Jesus is like,
what are you talking about? He's like, I mean, they're all good.
Like,
oh
gotcha. Yeah, it was. All those were like really good, but I like that they were like, what do we preach? Because you could very timidly say, I heal you. And then maybe it happens. Yeah. But you can't say, I preach you, and then the sermon happens.
Sermon happens,
like,
exactly.
Like, you got to start saying some words. And then maybe, like, God gives you the words. But, like, usually you aren't just like with a blank mind, open your mouth and start saying it. So I get how that would be like scary.
You see that at the very end where
terrifying.
Peter's like, Nathaniel or Nathan, you've done this before, like, or Philip, what have you done this before? And he's like, yeah, preached a couple times.
Not like
I feel like this is, not like this though. I feel like this is pretty different. And I'm like,
yeah. I think my favorite part of that whole 2x2 thing, which there were so many good parts, everything we mentioned already. My favorite part is a thing about the disciples I've never thought about before a day in my life, which is why Matthew was not the like disciples treasurer.
Yeah.
Never thought about it. Never put together that he's the money guy.
Yep.
And he's like, I don't want to keep money.
I've noticed
he's literally spent the whole past 2 episodes trying to get rid of his possessions, his house, all this stuff, because he's so ashamed and, just ashamed of the life he spent.
And I think it saw the grip it had on him. And he's like, I have no desire to put myself back underneath that grip of that. Yeah. And I think he feels it more of like, that had a hold of my heart for so long. I have no desire to give that any foothold.
Yeah.
You know, kind of like an alcoholic, like, hey, do you want to hold on to the, and he's like, no, I don't even want to touch it. Like, I have no desire to be even around it as much as possible. And maybe, obviously he's got some skills that they'll use, but I think he saw that as a temptation for control and a lack of faith.
Yeah.
Whereas it's crazy that he's like, Judas can do it. And you're like, no,
Matthew.
You're like, no,
he'll have money.
No.
He'll have 30 pieces of silver later. Yeah.
Well, and that brings me to that last thing about little James.
Yeah.
As far as I could tell, and maybe you need to help me understand this, but as far as I could tell, Jesus basically gave him the whole, like, Jesus gives his hardest battles to his toughest soldiers, like, speech.
Yeah.
And I know what the intention was, to basically give homage that you do not have to be healed to walk in full faith of Christ. You don't have to be fully healed to have full faith in Christ. And some people need to be healed in order to have faith. Some people need their hearts to be healed in order to be able to believe. But you will be an example of someone that doesn't need that to have full faith.
Yeah, even though he asked for it.
Even though he's asked for it.
Which seems like he needs that to have full faith.
And Jesus reassures him, and he basically says, like, he quotes Isaiah, like, you're going to jump like a deer, and he, like, makes him cry. And then he's like, and just so you know, you will be healed. You just need to hold on a little longer. Did you have any thought? Like, what were you thinking in that? What are you thinking?
What hit me so strong was, we've already talked about Big James and Little James, especially how they're portrayed here. And doesn't this seem exactly like Samuel looking through the sons of Jesse for a king?
Yeah.
Where there's the big 6-7 foot tall Saul lookalikes.
Yep.
Who you're like, Saul isn't working out, but somebody just like him would be great. Tall, strong, powerful. And that's who Big James is. Probably like 6'2", 6'4", looking in this show. Looks so tall. Yeah. Maybe everybody else is 5'8".
And his nose is like 4 inches.
Yeah.
Too, so
he's a big old dude.
Mm-hmm.
Very capable. The fact that Little James is also called to equally the same thing, and Jesus trusts him a lot, is crazy. But that's also the same as David, who was the shortest among his brothers, maybe because he was really young.
Yeah.
And his youngness is a thing that would normally disqualify him in human eyes. But James is a full-grown adult who's still short, who's still weak, little chubby, and he has a limp.
Yep.
So, like, it seems...
I mean, is it like the meek inherit the earth? I mean, are we talking like Sermon on the Mount stuff? Like,
this is why I'm in love with 1st and 2nd Corinthians as books. On top of all the R-rated weird crap that goes on in them, and there's a lot. There's so much.
There is
probably 10 solid things I could point out that are in 16 chapters. They're like, this is freaking weird.
It is.
Baptism of the dead. We have secret knowledge from God. And
we're marrying
much
our dad's wives, sisters, or whatever it is.
And women need to wear head coverings, don't you know? And like all this stuff that when we read it as the American church today, we're like,
Corinth would have made Las Vegas blush. So
yeah. Yep. Anyway, that's the reason I like Corinthians. he's fighting against, not fighting. That's not true. Paul is a missionary. He's an apostle. He has authority spiritually. He's like in the discipleship chain pipeline. Yeah. He's at the root. He is the stump or the root of the tree that's going to blossom into the churches in those areas. And they love power, prestige, entertainment, like production value, showiness.
Yep.
They are people who are like used to following prosperity preacher. That's like who they are. They're looking for the flashy, the big promises, so whatever. Paul is weak. He stutters. He's like unsure of himself sometimes.
He's compared to Hermes,
possibly
the short, fat.
Possibly short and fat and all these other things.
And maybe
not
blind.
Impressive looking. Kind of homeless because he's just this traveling, just staying on people's couches. Like
Tent maker.
That's who he is. So he fights them tooth and nail, both letters, out of love for sure, but fights them on like, stop showing each other up. Stop saving all your best food for your rich friends and not the poor brothers and sisters in the church. Stop doing all this other stuff. Because God is going to work more powerfully through your weakness than through your strength.
Yeah, and that's how 2 Corinthians basically ends with his testimony.
Yeah, it ends with his testimony and the thorn in the flesh.
Yep.
And he asked God to take it away. Doesn't this sound like little James? He asked God to take it away, and God has not. And we don't know what it is. We don't know if it's his stutter. We don't know if it's his like degenerative eye thing, cataracts,
like glaucoma or a cataract.
Because you can tell he's dictating this out loud to a scribe who's writing it down. Because at the end of this, and maybe Romans and some other letters, it's like, now I'm writing this in my own words. Thank this guy for writing it down for me. Yeah. So it's like, it's in the letter that he's doing that.
Says it in one of the letters, he says, see how I write with such big letters in my own hand. So it's,
So both of those things could be either of those. Could be he's been beaten up 100 times.
Arthritis, broken
back
bones.
Issues. He's been chained to walls for months at a time. Like, could be 100 things.
Shipwrecked twice.
Yeah, he has this whole testimony about how many times he's been hurt for Jesus. And he comes out of all this and he says, God told me, in your weakness, my power is made perfect. Yep. So, like, is this in line with God's heart? Heck yeah. That's a funny way to say that. But
no, and I felt that in that passage.
Heaven, yeah.
I think it was just so hard to
see a conversation about it that was succinct.
Yes, that felt so succinct. It just felt like Jesus is basically like, hey, hold on a little longer. I need your pain. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Like, I need your weakness.
It seemed a little used, but at the same time, like, I see that as a trend that's been true in, like, what's the word where it's just like your own experience true?
Yeah. Your perspective or your...
anecdotally true.
Yeah.
There we go.
Yep.
That's something I've noticed is anecdotally true and sometimes true in scripture, where it seems like believers of whatever stripe receive the biggest, wildest, craziest blessings at their lowest level of faith, which is usually at the beginning.
Yeah.
And the more committed they are, the more mature they are in their faith, the less grandiose usually their prayers get answered. That feels bad to say out loud, but think about Paul at the beginning. This blinding, crazy, like show from Jesus showing up in this insane way. But by the end, he's just murmuring to Jesus. And like, Jesus is not busting down a wall like the Kool-Aid man coming in to talk to him.
No.
He's just like praying.
But he has this confidence that is a reassurance, even if it's not in a blinding light.
Yeah.
I mean,
that's what I think Jesus is trying to call out of James to grow his own faith. But I do agree that the way they scripted the conversation sounds like, I want you to be in pain so I can use it as a good story, which sounds icky. But I think like Jesus knows what he's doing. And I think that if you were to ask Jesus after that scene, is this so that you'll look cool? Or is this so that his faith will grow? I think it would be the other way around.
100%. And I don't think I struggle with the concept. It was just the way, like, there's just so few times in this series that I've ever felt a little bit of like tension.
Yeah.
Like I almost always leave going
with
like,
yourself theologically
with who I feel like they are depicting Jesus in. And his words are so incredibly chosen in the series. And I need to go back and rewatch it because it was just in the moment. I just had a couple things.
It did feel weird. It felt like thin ice. Not like we're about to pounce on the Chosen and cancel them or anything. Love them. But it did feel like
I would have been more comfortable.
That was a solid answer to a thing that it doesn't seem like in the Gospels gets a solid answer, which is the weird part. Mm-hmm. It feels like if they were doing a scene where Jesus was like, don't tell anybody about me, the Messianic secret in Mark.
Yeah.
Don't tell anybody about me. And then they were like, what do you mean? And he's like, well, just do it. Just go tell people.
Just go tell
It feels like almost like, did you not read the words that you're just quoting?
Well, I just would have been more comfortable if you'd have been like, little James, I just need you to trust me. As you're healing, I need you to know that you're going to be healed someday. And just trust. Have the faith. Like, I almost like just a simpler, like you know what I mean? Like
more mystery answer.
Yes, rather than trying to nail it to the floor. But overall, this episode was awesome.
So
it
good.
Ended so. I'm so excited to see how the next. I think. All right, two things just keep surprising me about this.
Yeah.
This thing is funnier than I think it's gonna be. I always laugh. I find it like very like witty. And the way they pull humor and make these characters real.
It doesn't feel weird or fake when they use humor.
And then I also I'm incredibly impressed with how much they make you lean in.
Yeah.
Like there's so many parts in the movie where you're like, wait, I didn't think about that.
Yeah.
Like or the series, you're like, I didn't think about that.
I have 2 Bible degrees. And I was like, wait, why wasn't Matthew I was like, whoa.
I immediately am like leaning in, like, what is this? So hey, I hope you're continuing this journey with us. If you stuck on for this long and you listened to this whole ramble of a conversation, I am so proud of you. Gold star. Gold star. Double gold star.
30 gold stars, you Judas.
You wonderful mother that you are of me. I love you, Mom. If you loved it, you want to share it with others, you can maybe start the track. You can jump back to season 1 and catch up, or you can get ahead of us and wait for the next episodes to come out. I think all of them come out. We're gonna be trying to push these out as fast as we can over the coming weeks, and we're enjoying them. And I know you probably are too. You can leave a comment or leave a review on the podcast for Apple or any of the others. So any final thoughts? You good? Okay. Well. Gosh, I hope you guys will check out The Chosen if you haven't, and leave a comment on maybe something we missed from this episode or a thought you have from the things that we said. And if nothing else, have a great and glorious day in the Lord. We'll see you later.
See ya.